welcome. If you found your way here tonight, you're exactly where you need to be. Get comfortable, let your body settle into wherever you are, your bed, your chair, the quiet corner you've claimed for yourself at the end of a long day. Let your shoulders drop. Let your hands rest open, palms facing up, fingers loose. Tonight, we're going somewhere still. We're going to the Yorkshire coast, to a small stone town perched above the sea, where the wind comes off the water in long, slow waves, and the streets are narrow enough that two people passing each other must turn sideways, where the smell of salt and timber and wool has soaked into the walls of every building for 300 years. It is 1880. It is spring. And in a crooked little atelier on the far edge of town, a woman named Eleanor Voss is about to open a box she was never meant to find. But before we begin, if these stories help you rest, you're welcome to subscribe. There's a new Victorian sleep story here every week, and every one of them is made for nights exactly like this one. Take one more slow breath in and out. The town is waiting. The sign above the door had lost 2 of its letters. What remained read, Seamstress SS, Alterations and Fine Work, Est, 1841. The gaps where the S and E had been now just pale outlines on salt-bleached wood, like shadows of something that had once been whole. Eleanor Voss stood in the street and looked up at it for a long moment before she touched the door. She had been told the atelier had been empty for 11 years. She had been told the last woman to work here, a Mrs. Norah Penhaligon, had simply stopped coming one morning in 1869 and had never returned. No explanation, no forwarding address. The landlord, a Mr. Crail, had kept the rent unpaid notices in a drawer for 2 years before he'd finally accepted that no one was coming back. 11 years. And yet, when Eleanor pushed the door open and stepped inside, it did not feel like 11 years. It felt like an afternoon. The light came in through a single east-facing window, pale and clean and carrying the faint green quality of early spring. Dust moved in it, slow, unhurried, as if it had all the time in the world. The workbench along the far wall still held its tools, a pair of long-handled shears, a bone folder, worn smooth at the grip, 3 wooden spools of thread so old the color had faded to something between ivory and gray. A dress form stood in the corner, slightly tilted, draped in a length of dark wool that had been pinned in place and never finished. The pins were still there. The fabric had not shifted in 11 years. Eleanor set her bag down near the door and walked slowly through the room. She had come to Whitby from Halifax, where she had spent 7 years working in a drapery house. Good work, honest work, but work that had left her hands sore and her Sundays hollow. When her aunt had written to say that a small atelier near the Harbour had come available for a modest annual rent, she had said yes before she'd finished reading the letter. She had not expected this. She had expected emptiness, bare shelves, the neutral blankness of a room that had been cleared and forgotten. Instead, she found a room that had been abandoned mid-thought. She moved to the shelves along the back wall. There were bolts of fabric, some gone brittle at the edges, some still soft. There were pattern papers folded into careful squares, each one marked in a small, precise hand. Bodice, March 1867, sleeve variation, wider, Mrs. T's collar adjustment. There were buttons sorted by size into shallow tin dishes, bone and horn, and a few that might have been jet, though the light was too uncertain to be sure. And at the far end of the lowest shelf, tucked behind a bolt of unbleached muslin that had gone the color of old paper, there was a box. It was not remarkable to look at. Plain wood, perhaps 12 inches long and 8 wide, with a small brass clasp that had gone green at the edges. No label, no name, just the box itself, patient and still, waiting in the same dark corner where someone had placed it. Eleanor would later calculate. Sometime before 1869, she pulled it out carefully and set it on the workbench. The clasp opened without resistance, as if it had been waiting for exactly this. Inside, a man's coat, a naval coat, by the cut of it, heavy wool, double-breasted, the brass buttons stamped with an anchor. It had been folded with great care, each crease deliberate, the kind of folding that takes time and attention. Beneath the coat, a single sheet of paper, folded twice, with no name on the outside, and tucked inside the lining of the coat itself, visible only because the inner seam had begun to separate with age, the stitches pulling free one by one, as if the coat had been trying, slowly, to show someone what it held. A second piece of paper, smaller, older. The ink so faded it was nearly part of the fabric itself. Eleanor reached in and unfolded it. She read it once. Then she set it down on the workbench and stood very still for a moment, looking out through the east-facing window at the pale spring sky and the distant grey line of the sea. "If you are reading this," it said, "then I did not come back. And if I did not come back, then there are things you should know, things I could not say before I left, but could not leave unsaid." There was no name at the top. There was no name at the bottom. There was only the coat and the box and the 11 years of silence and the pale spring light moving through the dust. Eleanor looked at the letter for a long time. Then she pulled the stool from under the workbench, sat down, and began to read from the beginning. Whitby was not a town that apologized for itself. It sat on both sides of the River Esk, where the river met the sea, in a wide, grey-green mouth, and the two halves of the town, the old East Cliff and the newer West, were joined by a swing bridge that opened 4 times a day to let the fishing boats through. The streets on the east side were medieval in their logic, narrow, crooked, built by people who had been thinking about shelter and not about ease of passage. The steps up to the ruined abbey, 199 of them, as every local child could tell you, climbed the cliff in long, shallow rises, worn smooth by 3 centuries of feet. It smelled of the sea. It always smelled of the sea, even in the center of town, even on still days. There was salt in the air, and beneath it, the deeper, older smell of timber and rope and catch, the smell of a town that had made its living from the water for longer than anyone could remember. In 1880, Whitby was in transition. The railway had arrived 20 years earlier, and with it had come a different kind of visitor. Not the fishermen and merchants and pilots who had always been here, but tourists, people from Leeds and York and further, people who came to walk the cliff paths and sketch the abbey ruins and buy jet jewellery from the shops on Church Street. The jet trade had been booming for a decade, ever since the Queen had made mourning jewellery fashionable, and the workshop windows along the harbour glittered with polished black, brooches and bracelets and earrings, all cut from the dark fossilized wood that came out of the cliffs. It was a town caught between what it had been and what it was becoming. Eleanor had arrived 3 weeks before the day she found the box. She had come in on the morning train from York, a single trunk and a leather satchel, and had stood on the station platform for a long moment, looking at the town spread below her, the rooftops, the harbour, the dark stripe of the sea, before picking up her trunk and walking down into it. Her lodgings were on the west side, above a chandler's shop on Skinner Street, 2 rooms with low ceilings and a window that looked out over a narrow courtyard where someone kept a small grey cat that Eleanor had not yet managed to befriend. The landlady, a Mrs. Fowler, was a compact, efficient woman who asked few questions and made excellent porridge and had shown Eleanor the Atelier on her second morning in town, with the brisk air of someone completing a transaction. "Belonged to old Penhaligon," Mrs. Fowler had said, standing in the doorway without entering. "Before my time, mostly. They say she was very skilled. Never knew her myself." "What happened to her?" Eleanor had asked. Mrs. Fowler had considered the question. "Nobody knows, quite," she'd said at last. "One day she was here. Next day she wasn't. Some said she went to family in the south. Some said she went to sea." A small pause. "Some said other things." Eleanor had looked at the dusty room and the tilted dress form and the careful pins still holding their unfinished wool and the work she left behind. Mrs. Fowler had shrugged, a small, definitive movement. "Belonged to no one. Belongs to you now, I suppose, if you take the lease." And now, 3 weeks later, she sat on a worn wooden stool in the pale spring light, with a letter in her hands that had been waiting 11 years for someone to open it, and the coat folded carefully beside her, and the distant sound of the harbour, the creak of rigging, the call of gulls, the low moan of the swing bridge opening for the morning catch, coming through the single east-facing window. She did not yet know whose coat it was. She did not yet know who had written the letter, but she knew, with the particular certainty that comes sometimes without explanation, that she was going to find out. Eleanor Voss was 31 years old, and she had spent most of those years being quietly capable in ways that other people found convenient to overlook. She had grown up in a mill town outside Halifax, the middle of 5 children, in a household where competence was expected and praised only in its absence. Her mother had been a fine needlewoman, precise, patient, economical, with her stitches in a way that Eleanor had inherited, along with her grey eyes and her tendency to go still when she was thinking hard. Her father had worked the wool trade and had died of a chest complaint when Eleanor was 14, leaving her mother with the children and the small house and the knowledge that everything from that point forward would require careful management. Eleanor had gone to work at 16 in the drapery house, first as a junior assistant, then as a seamstress, then as the woman who trained the junior assistants. Though her title never changed to reflect the last of these responsibilities, and her wages changed only modestly, she had not complained about this, because she was not by nature a person who complained. But she had noticed. She noticed most things. It was a quality that served her well in her work and made her, she suspected, occasionally uncomfortable company. She noticed when a seam was pulling before it tore. She noticed when a customer's measurements had changed since their last fitting, and the customer did not want this mentioned. She noticed the way certain men in the drapery house spoke to the junior girls, and she had found ways, quiet, unremarkable ways, to make those conversations shorter and less frequent. She had never married. This was not, as Mrs. Fowler and several women of her acquaintance seemed to assume, a source of private grief. It was simply a fact, like the grey of her eyes and the steadiness of her hands. There had been, at 24, a man named Robert Ashby, kind, earnest, genuinely fond of her, and she had been fond of him in return. But fond was not, she had concluded, sufficient, and Robert had agreed in the end, and had married a woman in Keighley who was very fond of him indeed, and Eleanor had wished them both well, and meant it. What she had wanted, for longer than she could precisely say, was this: a room of her own, work that was hers, a door she could close at the end of the day that opened onto her own space and no one else's. Whitby was a beginning. She had not expected the Atelier to come with a mystery attached. She was not. She would have told you firmly, the sort of person who went looking for mysteries. She was the sort of person who repaired things, fabrics, seams, the small structural failures that accumulated in garments over years of wear. She was precise and patient and fundamentally practical. But she had read the letter on the first morning, sitting on the worn stool in the pale spring light, and she had read it twice more since, and she had not been able to stop thinking about it. If you are reading this, then I did not come back. Someone had written those words. Someone had folded them into the lining of a coat with the careful, deliberate fingers of a person who knew how to work with their hands. The stitches used to conceal the paper were small and even, and had held for 11 years, which meant they had been done well. Someone had placed that coat in a box and left it on a shelf in a room they clearly intended to return to. And then they had not returned. Eleanor had asked Mrs. Fowler, carefully, what she knew of Norah Penhaligon. Mrs. Fowler had known little, only that the woman had been widowed young, had run the Atelier alone for many years, had been well regarded for her work on the finer commissions. No children, no family locally, as far as anyone knew. Eleanor had asked about the coat. Mrs. Fowler had not known of any coat. She had asked, last, whether anyone in Whitby might remember Mrs. Penhaligon more personally, a neighbour, a customer, an old acquaintance. Mrs. Fowler had thought about this. "There's old Mr. Casson," she'd said at last, "on Henrietta Street, the east side. He's been here longer than anyone. Whether he'll talk to you is another matter. He doesn't talk to most people." Eleanor had written the name in her workbook, Casson, Henrietta Street. Then she had looked at the coat, folded neatly on the corner of her workbench, and the letter beside it, and the spring light moving over both, and she had thought, someone wrote this. Someone left this. Someone, somewhere, has been waiting 11 years for an answer. She picked up the letter again and read it from the beginning. This time, she read it slowly, looking for the shape of the person inside the words. The letter was not long. That was the first thing Eleanor noticed. Not its contents, but its economy. The handwriting was small and controlled, the lines evenly spaced, the margins observed with the discipline of someone who had learned to be careful with paper. There was no wasted space. Every word had been chosen. She had seen handwriting like this before, in the pattern papers on the shelf, in the small notations folded into bolts of fabric. Bodice, March 1867. Sleeve variation, wider. Mrs. T's collar adjustment, the same hand, the same precision. This letter had been written by Norah Penhaligon. Eleanor set it flat on the workbench and smoothed the creases carefully with the side of her hand. The paper was fragile at the folds. 11 years of being compressed inside a coat lining had made it tender, and she handled it the way she handled old fabrics, with attention, without force. She read it for the 4th time. If you are reading this, then I did not come back. And if I did not come back, then there are things you should know. Things I could not say before I left, but could not leave unsaid. The coat belongs to Thomas Cairn. He is, or was by the time you read this, I cannot say which, a merchant sailor, born in Stromness in the Orkneys, 37 years of age as of this writing. He brought the coat to me in February of this year for repairs to the lining. He told me it had belonged to his father. He told me he was leaving Whitby on the 14th of March, on the Perseverance, bound for Hamburg, and then south. He did not collect the coat before he left. I thought at first it was an oversight. Then I thought it was something else. I wrote to the shipping company, Hargreave and Sons on Grape Lane, and they told me the Perseverance had left on schedule and that Thomas Cairn had been aboard. Then I thought about why a man might leave his father's coat behind deliberately, why he might not come to collect it, why he might not send word. I thought about it for a long time, and then I thought, if something has happened to him, someone should know what is in this coat. I have not opened the inner lining completely. I could feel, through the fabric, that there was something there, not just the paper you are reading now, but something else, something small and hard, something that has been sewn in with more care than the rest of the garment deserves. I did not open it. It was not mine to open, but it is yours now, whoever you are. You found the box. You opened the letter. That means enough time has passed that the ordinary rules no longer apply. Find out what happened to Thomas Cairn. If he is alive, return the coat to him. If he is not, then do what seems right. There is something in the lining. I do not know what it is, but I know it was put there by hands that meant it to be found. I am leaving Whitby tonight. I cannot explain why in this letter. There is not enough time, and some of it is not mine to tell. But I could not leave without doing this much. Do what you can. N.P. Eleanor read it a 5th time. Then she sat for a long while without reading anything, looking at the coat. Thomas Cairn, Stromness, Orkneys. The Perseverance, bound for Hamburg, March 1869. 11 years ago, she reached for the coat and turned it carefully in her hands, running her fingers along the inner lining. Norah had been right. There was something there. Along the lower right panel, where the lining met the hem, she could feel it, a small, firm shape beneath the fabric, perhaps 1.5 inches across, sewn in with stitches that were slightly different from the rest of the lining, tighter, more deliberate. The stitches of someone who needed this to hold. She found her seam ripper on the workbench, small, bone-handled, the tool she used for extractions, and made a careful incision along the newer stitches. The object fell into her palm. It was a ring, plain gold, narrow band, no engraving on the outside. She turned it to the light and looked inside the band, where an engraver's tool had left 3 lines of tiny text. T.C.M.H., the 14th of June, 1866. She set it on the workbench beside the letter and looked at both for a long time. Thomas Cairn, M.H., June 1866. A wedding ring, sewn into the lining of a coat that a man had left behind deliberately before sailing away from Whitby in the spring of 1869. Eleanor had a habit, when confronted with a problem she could not immediately solve, of breaking it into its component parts the way she would break down a pattern, identifying the separate pieces before trying to understand how they fit together. She did this now, methodically. Piece 1. Thomas Cairn had brought a coat to Norah Penhaligon for repairs in February 1869. Piece 2. The coat had a ring sewn into its lining, a wedding ring, engraved with initials, and a date, 3 years before the repairs. Piece 3. Thomas Cairn had left Whitby in March 1869 without collecting the coat, without, therefore, the ring. Piece 4. Norah Penhaligon had left Whitby sometime shortly thereafter, in such haste or under such circumstances that she had not been able to return, and had hidden the coat and the letter in the box on the shelf for whoever came next. Piece 5. No one had come for 11 years, until now. Eleanor looked out through the east-facing window. The morning light had shifted. It was fuller now, the pale green of early spring giving way to something warmer. She could hear the harbour more clearly, the gulls, the creak of timber, a voice calling out a name she couldn't make out. Somewhere in this town, or perhaps not in this town any longer, there were people who had known Thomas Cairn, People who had known Norah Penhaligon. People who might be able to tell her what had happened in the spring of 1869, and why a man had left his father's coat, and what appeared to be his wedding ring behind when he sailed away. She picked up her workbook and wrote beneath Casson, Henrietta Street, Hargreave and Sons, Grape Lane, shipping records, 1869, Perseverance, MH, initials, female, the 14th of June, 1866, marriage record, why leave the ring? She underlined the last question twice. Then she folded the letter back along its original creases, carefully, gently, the way it had been folded before, and placed it inside the ring, inside the coat, and set the coat back in the box. She would need to go to Grape Lane. She would need to find Mr. Casson. She would need to look at the marriage records at St. Mary's, if they went back to 1866, which they would. St. Mary's had been recording the lives of Whitby's people since long before anyone currently living could remember. But first, she would open the Atelier. It was a Wednesday in April, and people in Whitby had clothes that needed mending, and she had a business to establish, and a sign with 2 missing letters, and a dress form in the corner still wearing someone else's unfinished work. She would attend to Thomas Cairn in the hours the daylight left her. The first customer came at 9:30. She was a young woman, perhaps 20, with a confident walk and a basket over her arm, and the direct gaze of someone who had grown up near the sea and had absorbed its habit of looking at things straight on. Her name was Ada Vickers, and she had a coat with a split shoulder seam and a skirt hem that had been pinned up rather than properly turned. "Mrs. Fowler said you'd started," Ada said, looking around the atelier with frank curiosity. "Said you were from Halifax." "I am," said Eleanor. "You'll find it different here." Ada set the coat on the counter with the ease of someone who had been coming to this address her whole life. Penhaligon used to do all the Harbour families. My mother's wedding dress was made here. I used to come with her as a child. She paused, looking at the dress form in the corner. "You haven't moved her things?" "Not yet," said Eleanor. "I wasn't sure what to do with them." Ada considered this. "Penhaligon's been gone since I was 9, she said. "I don't suppose anyone's coming back for them." She said it without sentiment, as a simple statement of fact. "What do you want for the seam?" Eleanor quoted a price. Ada agreed without negotiation, which suggested Eleanor had quoted too low, a mistake she noted for future reference. "Did you know her?" Eleanor asked as she examined the split seam. "Mrs. Penhaligon?" "A little. As a child, you know someone's face without knowing anything else about them." She was quiet, very neat. She had. Ada paused, searching. She had that quality some people have, where you feel they're always thinking about something else, something they haven't told you. A short pause. She was kind, though. "She taught me to thread a needle once, when I was waiting for my mother. Showed me how to hold the thread so it didn't knot." Eleanor made a note of this. Kind, quiet, private. "Do you know why she left?" Eleanor asked. Ada's expression shifted slightly. A small movement, almost imperceptible, the expression of someone who knows something and is deciding how much of it to share. "There were stories," she said. "There are always stories in a town this size." "What kind of stories?" "The usual kind." Ada looked at Eleanor with the direct, sea-level gaze she'd come in with. A man involved, some said. Someone she was connected to who had left badly. Some said she'd had word that someone had died. A pause. No one knew for certain. She just stopped being here. Eleanor stitched in silence for a moment. "Have you ever heard the name Thomas Cairn?" Ada thought about it. "It's not a Whitby name," she said. "Cairn is an Orcadian name. We get sailors through from the northern islands sometimes. The fishing trade, mostly, and some of the merchant lines. But it's not a name I know." She paused. "Why?" "I found something in the Atelier," Eleanor said carefully. "Something that was left behind. I'm trying to understand who it belonged to." Ada looked at her with the frank appraising look again. "You should talk to Mr. Casson," she said. "On Henrietta Street. He was harbour master's assistant for 30 years. If someone came through this port, he'll know." Mrs. Fowler mentioned him. "He's difficult," Ada said. "But he's honest. If he knows something, he'll tell you. He just won't make it easy." She picked up her repaired coat and examined the seam with a practiced eye, then gave a short nod of approval. "You do good work," she said. Penhaligon would have approved. She left 2 shillings on the counter and went out into the spring morning. 3 more customers came that day. A woman with a morning dress that needed its cuffs letting out. A young man, a boat builder's apprentice by his hands, with a tear in a working jacket that he wanted made invisible rather than merely mended. An older woman, Mrs. Harker, who brought nothing to be repaired but had come, Eleanor understood, to inspect the new seamstress and form an opinion, which she did with thoroughness and departed without sharing. Between customers, Eleanor worked on the atelier itself, sorting the pattern papers, cataloguing the buttons, deciding what to keep and what had outlived its usefulness. She was methodical about it, which was the only way she knew how to be. She kept the pattern papers. Norah's handwriting, in its small, precise notation, felt like a record of something, of a working life, of years spent attending to the details of other people's appearances, and Eleanor could not bring herself to discard it. She stacked the papers carefully in a flat box and set them on the high shelf. She kept the bone folder, the shears, the wooden spools now rewound with new thread. She returned the dress form to the corner, straightened its tilt, and carefully removed the pinned wool, not discarding it either, but folding it and setting it aside. Someone had intended to finish this. The least she could do was treat it as if finishing were still possible. At 4 o'clock, she locked the atelier and walked across the swing bridge to the east side. Henrietta Street ran along the base of the cliff below the Abbey steps, a narrow row of cottages with their backs to the stone and their fronts to the river. Number 14 had a small iron anchor above the door, the old harbour master's insignia, and a window box with early spring flowers, purple and white, precise and well tended. Eleanor knocked. The door was opened, after a pause, by a man who appeared to be somewhere in his late 70s, with a broad, weathered face and eyes that were a very pale, clear grey, the colour of the sea on overcast days. He looked at Eleanor without expression for a moment. "Mr. Casson," she said. "My name is Eleanor Voss. I've taken the lease on the old Penhaligon Atelier. I'm looking into something that was left there." He studied her for another moment. Then he stepped back from the door. "You'd better come in," he said. The inside of Mr. Casson's cottage was exactly what Eleanor would have predicted from the outside. Orderly, spare, everything in its place with the precision of a man who had spent decades managing systems where disorder had consequences. A small parlour, a fireplace with a low fire despite the mildness of the April afternoon, bookshelves along one wall, mostly ledgers and almanacs and tide tables dating back 30 years. He did not offer tea. He sat in the chair by the fire and gestured her to the ones opposite, and looked at her with the pale grey eyes that gave away nothing but attention. "Penhaligon's Atelier," he said. You've taken the lease 3 weeks ago, and you found something there. A box, Eleanor said, on the lowest shelf, behind some fabric. A man's naval coat, and a letter written by Mrs. Penhaligon, and, inside the coat lining, a gold ring. She paused. The ring is engraved, T.C. to M.H., 14th of June, 1866. Something moved in Mr. Casson's face, so briefly, so small that Eleanor almost missed it, but she was a person who noticed things. T.C., he said. Thomas Cairn, Eleanor said. According to the letter, a merchant sailor from Stromness in the Orkneys, Mrs. Penhaligon wrote that he brought the coat to her in February 1869, that he sailed from Whitby in March of that year on a ship called the Perseverance, bound for Hamburg, and that he did not collect the coat before he left. Mr. Casson was quiet for a moment. Thomas Cairn, he said again. It was not a question. He said it the way you say a name you haven't spoken aloud in a long time, and are feeling the shape of again. You knew him, Eleanor said. I knew of him. Casson looked at the fire for a moment, then back at Eleanor. He came through Whitby several times in the mid-60s. Crude on the northern merchant routes, wool and coal mostly, some timber. He was well regarded, reliable, not a man who made trouble. A pause. In 1866, he married a local woman, M.H., Eleanor said. Margaret Holt. Casson's voice was even, measured. Her father was a chandler on Skinner Street. Margaret was the elder of 2 daughters. She died in the autumn of 1868. A fever, very sudden, very fast. She was 24. The room was quiet, except for the low sound of the fire. Eleanor looked at the ring in her mind. T.C. M.H., the 14th of June, 1866, and thought about a man who had had his wedding ring sewn into the lining of his dead wife's father's coat. He came back to Whitby after she died, she asked. Once, Casson said. The winter of 1868, just before Christmas. He was not in a good state, by what I heard. He called on the Holt family, the father, Edmund Holt. He was there perhaps 2 days, then gone. The next I heard, he was back in Whitby the following February, and then he sailed in March. A pause. On the Perseverance, as you say. And after that? Casson was quiet. Mr. Casson, Eleanor said, carefully. The Perseverance reached Hamburg, he said. I verified this at the time. I had reason to. He paused. After Hamburg, she was meant to sail south to Lisbon. She did not arrive in Lisbon. She was reported overdue in May of 1869, Casson said. By September, Hargreave and Sons had accepted that she was lost. There were 17 men aboard. He looked at Eleanor steadily. Thomas Cairn was among them. The spring light outside the window was warm and golden now, the late afternoon kind that made everything look briefly more resolved than it was. Eleanor sat with the information and let it settle. Thomas Cairn had left his wife's ring behind, sewn into his coat, hidden in a box, left with a woman he trusted, before sailing on a ship that never arrived. He had known, she thought, or he had suspected, or he had simply been the kind of man who, having lost everything that mattered, had found himself unable to carry the proof of it any further. He left it deliberately, she said aloud. Not a question. That would be my reading, Casson said. A man who sews a ring into a coat lining and leaves the coat with a seamstress is not a man who forgot it. He paused. Norah Penhaligon understood that too, I think. She was a perceptive woman. You knew her. A pause. Yes. Did you know why she left? The pale grey eyes looked at Eleanor for a long moment. She left because she had to, Casson said, at last. The circumstances were, they were not hers alone. There was another family involved, and it was made clear to her that staying would cause harm to people she cared about. She was a woman who preferred to absorb difficulty rather than distribute it. Eleanor thought of the letter. I cannot explain why in this letter there is not enough time, and some of it is not mine to tell. Is she alive? Eleanor asked. Another pause. Longer this time. As far as I know, Casson said. She is in Bristol. She has a sister there. I had a letter from her, from Norah, some years ago. Just a note. She said she was well. He looked at the fire. I did not write back. I should have written back. Mr. Casson, Eleanor said gently, what happened in the spring of 1869? Not the parts that are yours, but the parts that I need to know. He looked at her for a long time. Then he nodded, very slowly, as if he had been waiting 11 years for someone to ask him exactly that question, and had finally, at last, been given permission to answer. Edmund Holt had been a chandler on Skinner Street for 30 years, and in that time he had built, by the standards of the town, a modest prosperity, a solid shop, a house behind it, 2 daughters raised without debt, and with enough education to give them choices their mother had not had. Margaret had been the elder. Margaret had been, by all accounts, the livelier of the two, quick, sociable, inclined to laughter. She had met Thomas Cairn at a Harbour festival in 1865, had corresponded with him for a year while he was at sea, and had married him in the summer of 1866 in St. Mary's Church on the East Cliff, on a June afternoon when the whole town seemed to have turned out. Edmund Holt had not approved of the match. This was the part Casson told slowly, as if he were picking his way across uncertain ground. Holt had not disapproved of Thomas Cairn personally. The man was decent, hard-working, from a respectable Orcadian family. What Holt had disapproved of was the life. A merchant sailor's wife was a woman who spent most of her married years alone, managing a household on remittances and letters, growing old in the gaps between voyages. He had watched this happen to women in the town his whole life. He had not wanted it for Margaret. Margaret had disagreed. She had always disagreed with her father on matters of this kind, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet, consistent persistence that Casson described as being, in its own way, as immovable as the cliff. They had married. Thomas had sailed. Margaret had managed. Edmund Holt had helped, because he was not an unkind man, and because his daughter was happy, and he had eventually reconciled himself to the life she had chosen. And then the fever had come in the autumn of 1868, and Margaret had been gone in 10 days. Thomas had returned to Whitby that winter, as Casson had said, just before Christmas, and what had happened between him and Edmund Holt during those 2 days, Casson did not know in full, but he knew the shape of it. He knew that Edmund Holt had gone to Norah Penhaligon, who was known to them both as the seamstress who had made Margaret's wedding dress, and who had been, Casson said carefully, a person both Thomas and Margaret had trusted, and he knew that Holt had asked her a question. He had asked her whether Thomas, in the weeks before he'd left for Hamburg, had spoken to her of any arrangements he'd made, whether he'd left anything with her. Norah had said no. This was technically true. Thomas had not spoken to Norah of arrangements. He had simply brought her a coat to repair, and left without collecting it. And the arrangement, if it could be called that, had been implicit, unspoken, a thing communicated in the act of leaving rather than in any words. But Edmund Holt had understood, or suspected, more than Norah had told him. He came back, Casson said, after Thomas sailed. He came back to Norah. He told her that Thomas had, before he left, altered the provisions of a small trust, an amount of money held jointly in both their names since the marriage, which would, in the ordinary way of things, have reverted to Edmund after Margaret's death. Thomas had redirected it, changed the beneficiary, and Eleanor was very still. To whom? Casson looked at her. To a woman in Hull, he said. A widow with a young child. A woman whose name was not in any record Holt could find, only the legal document, signed and witnessed, transferring the trust. M.H., Eleanor said very quietly. Casson blinked. I beg your pardon. The ring, she said. T.C. To M.H., but the child's mother. Her initials were also M.H. A silence. Her name was Mary Heron, Casson said slowly. She had been some years before, a woman Thomas had known before he married Margaret, before he came to Whitby even, from his time on the northern routes. He paused. The child was a boy, 3 years old in 1869. His name was James. Eleanor sat with this for a moment, turning it over, the way she turned a piece of fabric to find the grain. Edmund Holt believed that Thomas was the boy's father, she said. He believed it. He couldn't prove it. Thomas never confirmed it, not to Holt, not as far as anyone knew, to anyone. But he had changed the trust. He had made provision. Casson paused, and then he had sailed, and Norah, Holt, came to her. He was not violent. He was not that kind of man, but he was angry and frightened, and he told her that if she had helped Thomas conceal any of this, the ring, the coat, any document, anything, she would be named in a legal action he intended to bring to contest the trust redirection. He said her reputation in the town would not survive it. The fire had burned lower. The light through the window was nearly orange now, the long gold of late afternoon. He was bluffing, Eleanor said. Almost certainly, Casson agreed. But Norah was alone, and her livelihood depended entirely on the goodwill of the families in this town, and Edmund Holt was a man those families respected. A pause. She left within the week. She left to protect herself. And to protect the boy, Casson said quietly. If she had stayed, and Holt had pressed the matter, the legal action would have drawn attention to Mary Heron and the child in Hull. Norah understood that. She chose to disappear the problem, as it were. Eleanor looked at the window. Outside, Whitby was settling into its evening, the lamps coming on, the harbour quieting, the abbey ruins above the east cliff going dark against the pale sky. Somewhere in Bristol, Norah Penhaligon was alive. Somewhere, perhaps still in Hull, perhaps elsewhere by now, a man named James would be 22 years old, and on the workbench in the Atelier, on the far edge of town, a ring and a letter were waiting. Eleanor walked back across the swing bridge in the last of the evening light. The bridge was open for the final time that day, the slow machinery of it turning to let a fishing smack through, and she stood on the west bank and watched the boat pass. Low in the water, the catch already unloaded at the quay, the two men aboard silent and unhurried, with the ease of people returning to a place they had left the same morning. The bridge swung back, the mechanism settled. The river ran on, dark and smooth, toward the sea. She walked up Skinner Street without stopping at her lodgings, past the chandler's shop, which had not been Holt's chandler's shop for many years now, the sign above the door bearing a different name entirely, and through the quiet upper streets to the Atelier. She let herself in and lit the lamp on the workbench. The box was where she had left it, the coat inside, the letter beside it, the ring. She sat down on the stool and looked at all of it for a long time. There was a version of this situation that required nothing of her. She had found an object, she had asked some questions, she had established as thoroughly as could be established at a distance of 11 years, what the object was and how it had come to be here. She could place it in the keeping of a solicitor, there were 2 in Whitby, and wash her hands of it. This would be reasonable. This would be, by most standards, more than was required. She knew she was not going to do that. The question was what she was going to do instead. There were 3 people, living or possibly living, whose lives were threaded through this coat and this ring. Norah Penhaligon in Bristol, who had left the letter and carried the weight of it for 11 years, and had never been told what had happened to the Perseverance. Mary Heron, or whatever name she went by now, in Hull, who had received a trust from a man who had then sailed away and never come back, and who might or might not have known that Thomas was gone. And James, the boy who was now a man of 22, who might or might not know that his father had, in the only way available to him, tried to provide for his future. None of them knew what the others knew. None of them had access to the full account. The full account was here, on the workbench, in a coat and a ring and a letter and the words of an old man in a cottage on Henrietta Street. Eleanor picked up her workbook and wrote 2 things. Write to Norah Penhaligon, Bristol. Tell her the Perseverance did not arrive. Thomas is gone. The coat has been found. She did not fail him. Go to Hull. She looked at the second line for a moment. It was not a small thing, going to Hull. It would require closing the Atelier for at least 2 days. It would require spending money she had not yet earned. It would require arriving at the door of a woman she had never met and explaining, as clearly and kindly as she could, a situation of considerable complexity and old grief. It would require giving the ring to someone who might not want it, or who might need it very badly. Eleanor did not know which it was, but she thought that a woman who had been quietly provided for by a man who had then disappeared, who had perhaps spent 11 years not knowing why he hadn't written, why he hadn't come, whether he had simply decided to forget, deserved to know the truth of it, the full truth. Not the partial truth that circumstances had left her with, but the real account, that Thomas Cairn had made provision for her, and for the boy, had left his wife's ring behind rather than carry it any further, had sailed on a ship that had not arrived. That he had not forgotten. That the silence had not been indifference. Eleanor wrote a 3rd line. The ring belongs with James. She was not entirely certain of this, but it felt true in the way that certain seams felt right, not because they were easy, but because they lay flat, because they held, because everything else in the construction depended on them being placed correctly. A man had sewn his wedding ring into a coat lining and left it behind for reasons that had seemed, to everyone who encountered them, to be obscure. But Eleanor thought she understood them now. He had not been able to keep it, and had not been able to discard it. He had not been able to give it to Edmund Holt, and had not been able to give it to Mary. He had been a man carrying more grief than he could hold, sailing towards something he may have expected to be an ending. and he had left the ring in the one place where he trusted it might someday find its way to someone who could decide what to do with it. He had left it with a seamstress, with someone whose work was the joining of separate pieces into something whole. Eleanor thought this might not have been entirely coincidental. She folded the letter back along its creases. She placed the ring inside. She closed the box and set it on the high shelf, above the pattern papers in Norah's small, precise hand, above the spools of thread and the sorted buttons, and all the careful accumulated evidence of a working life. Then she took out a clean sheet of paper, dipped her pen, and began to write. Dear Mrs. Penhaligon, my name is Eleanor Voss, and I have recently taken the lease on your atelier on the far edge of Whitby. I hope this letter finds you well, and that it does not come as too much of a shock. I am writing because I have found something that I believe belongs, in some important sense, to you, or rather, something that you left behind with the intention that it should be found. And I wanted you to know that it has been, and that I have done my best to understand it, and that I hope what I have learned will bring you some small measure of peace. I will write the rest of the account on the following pages. Please read it when you are ready. I also intend, with your blessing, to travel to Hull. She paused and added, You did not fail him. I want you to know that first, before anything else. She wrote for an hour, until the lamp began to gutter, and the street outside had gone fully quiet, and the only sounds were the distant sea and the low call of a night bird somewhere up on the cliff. The train to Hull left Whitby station at 7:40 in the morning. Eleanor had written to no one in Hull before going. There was no address to write to, and she had decided, after some deliberation, that a letter announcing her arrival would be harder to answer than a person standing at a door. She had asked Mr. Casson, on a second visit the morning after the first, whether he knew anything further about Mary Heron's whereabouts, and he had told her that the last he had known, which was 1869, and therefore of limited reliability, Mary Heron had lived on Finkel Street, near the old dock quarter, in a rented house with a boy. 11 years is a long time, Eleanor had said. It is, Casson had agreed, but if she received the trust, she will have had some means. She may still be there, or the neighbors will know where she went. He had also given her, without being asked, a small piece of information that he had not volunteered on the first visit. He said it with the careful deliberateness of a man who had decided, between her 2 visits, that he had been less than complete. Thomas Kane, he said, was not a dishonest man. I want you to understand that. What happened with Mary Heron, the child, the provision, was not a matter of deceit, or not entirely. Margaret knew of the boy. She and Thomas had spoken of it before they married. She was, he paused, searching for the precise word. She was a woman of considerable generosity. She said that a child deserved a father's provision regardless of the circumstances of his birth, and that if Thomas wished to make provision, she would not oppose it. Another pause. Edmund Holt did not know this. Margaret had not told him. She knew what his answer would have been. Eleanor had sat with this for a moment. So the trust was not a secret kept from Margaret. No, it was a secret kept from her father. Casson looked at the fire. Thomas rewrote it after Margaret died, because he was, I think, afraid. He did not know how long he had. He did not know what the voyage would bring, and he wanted to be certain. The train moved through the North Yorkshire landscape in the early morning. The moors, rolling back on both sides, brown and gold in the spring light, the sky wide and pale, and filled with the particular quality of northern air that felt like thinking made visible. Eleanor sat by the window, with her bag on the seat beside her and the box, the coat, the ring, the letter, tucked carefully inside. She had packed for one night. She had left a note on the Atelier door. Closed Wednesday. Open Thursday. She had told Mrs. Fowler only that she had business in Hull, and Mrs. Fowler had accepted this with the incuriosity of a woman who had decided, on brief acquaintance, that Eleanor Voss was the sort of person whose business would be sensible. The journey took most of the morning, changing at Seamer and again at Bridlington, arriving into Hull's Paragon station just before noon. Finkel Street was not difficult to find. It was a narrow street in the old dock quarter, as Casson had said, a row of modest, terraced houses, well kept for the most part, with the particular tidiness of streets, where people could not afford to let things deteriorate. Number 11 had a window box with late spring flowers, purple and yellow, and a brass door knocker shaped like a ship's wheel that had been polished recently enough to catch the noon light. Eleanor stood on the pavement for a moment. She had thought, on the train, about what to say. She had rehearsed several versions of it, careful versions, structured versions, versions that began with the least alarming information and built toward the more difficult. She had discarded all of them by the time she reached Bridlington, because the truth was that there was no sequence in which this information was easy to receive, and the kindest thing she could do was to say it clearly and let the woman before her decide how to hold it. She knocked. The door was opened by a woman of perhaps 40, dark-haired, with a steady, careful face, and eyes that were a warm brown, and that looked at Eleanor with the patient wariness of someone who had learned to assess strangers quickly. She was wearing a good wool dress, simply cut, and had the hands of someone who had done fine work for many years. "Mrs. Heron," Eleanor said. A pause. "Miss Heron," the woman said. "I never married." She looked at Eleanor steadily. "You're not from the trust office?" "No," Eleanor said. "My name is Eleanor Voss. I've taken the lease on a seamstress's atelier in Whitby, a woman named Norah Penhaligon's atelier. I've found something there that I believe belongs to you, or to your son." She paused. "May I come in?" Mary Heron looked at her for a long moment. Then she stepped back from the door. The parlour was small and neat, with a good fire and the smell of beeswax and something baking somewhere at the back of the house. On the mantelpiece there was a photograph, a formal portrait, the kind taken at a studio, of a young man in his early 20s, dark-haired like his mother, with a serious expression that had in it, when Eleanor looked carefully, something of the set of a jaw she had seen in her mind's eye these past 3 days, whenever she had tried to imagine Thomas Cairn. She set her bag on the floor and took out the box. She placed it on the table between them and opened it. The coat lay folded inside, dark and still. The letter beside it. The ring. Mary Heron looked at the coat for a long time without speaking. Then, very slowly, she reached out and touched the wool, just lightly, with the tips of her fingers, the way you touch something you recognize. "He brought this to Whitby," she said very quietly. "When he went to see Edmund Holt, he told me he needed to have the lining repaired." A pause, barely longer than a breath. "I didn't know he'd left it. He didn't collect it," Eleanor said gently. "Mrs. Penhaligon kept it. She left a letter with it explaining what she knew, asking whoever found it to do what seemed right." She paused. "I found it 3 days ago." Mary Heron's hand rested on the wool of the coat. "The ship," she said. "The Perseverance. It was reported lost in the autumn of 1869, Eleanor said. "I'm sorry, I don't know if you knew." "I knew," Mary said. "Or I came to know. There was a period, 2 years nearly, when I didn't know." The trust payments came, and I told myself. She stopped, and then a man from the shipping company came to Hull in the spring of 1871. He had a list of names. Her voice was even, careful, the voice of someone who had done the work of grief some years ago and now could speak of it without it taking her under. I knew then. "I'm sorry," Eleanor said again. Mary nodded, just once, accepting it. The young man in the photograph came home at 2:30. His name was James Heron. He went by his mother's name, as she had asked him to when he was old enough to understand the question. He was 22 years old, and he worked as a draftsman at one of the Hull shipping offices, which was a fact that struck Eleanor when Mary told her as the kind of coincidence that was not entirely a coincidence, the son of a sailor finding his way back to the sea by the route available to him. He came in through the back of the house and appeared in the parlour doorway, still carrying his jacket, and looked at the woman he didn't know sitting at the table with his mother, and at the box between them, and was still. Mary said quietly, "Come and sit down, James." He sat. Eleanor told the account a second time, more briefly than she had told it to Mary, but completely, leaving nothing out. The atelier, the box, the coat, the letter, Casson and the perseverance, Margaret Holt, and what Casson had said about her, that she had known of the boy, that she had not opposed the provision, that the trust had not been a betrayal but a kept promise. James listened without interrupting. He had his mother's quality of stillness, the same patient, contained attention, the same habit of letting information arrive fully before responding to it. But his hands, Eleanor noticed, were gripping the edge of the table as she spoke, not hard enough to show distress to a casual eye, but enough that she could see the whitening of the knuckle. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. He knew the ship might not arrive, he said. It was not a question. I think he was not certain, Eleanor said carefully, but I think he was a man who believed in being prepared for uncertainty. James looked at the box. May I? He took out the coat first and held it for a moment, just held it, the weight of it in his hands, before laying it carefully across his knees. Then the letter, which he read in full, very slowly, without expression. Then the ring, which he turned in the light the way Eleanor had turned it 3 days ago, reading the inscription with the same careful attention. T.C. M.H., the 14th of June, 1866. He set the ring in his palm and looked at it. M.H., he said. Margaret Holt. Yes. He was quiet. Not my mother. No, Eleanor said. But he kept it because... She paused, choosing the words carefully. I think he kept it because it was the last thing he had that was entirely his own. And I think he couldn't carry it, and couldn't discard it, and couldn't give it to Edmund Holt. So he left it with someone he trusted, and hoped that it would find its way. James looked at the ring for a long time. Then he looked at his mother. Something passed between them in that look, a long, quiet communication of the kind that happens between two people who have spent years in a small house with a large absence and have learned to speak about it without words. Mary gave a very small nod. James closed his hand around the ring. Thank you, he said to Eleanor. His voice was steady but only just. For coming. You didn't have to come. Someone should have come, Ellen, years ago, Eleanor said simply. I'm sorry it took this long. He shook his head. You couldn't have known. No, but Mrs. Penhaligon left the letter, so that someone would eventually know. She trusted that the right person would find it. Eleanor looked at the coat on his knees. She was right, I think, about leaving it. James looked down at the coat. He ran one hand along the lapel, a slow, deliberate movement, not quite a caress, more the gesture of someone taking careful inventory of something they hadn't expected to be given. "What will you do with the ring?" Eleanor asked. She had not planned to ask this. It was his decision, entirely, and she had told herself on the train that she would deliver the items and the account and leave the rest to the people it belonged to. But the question had come out anyway, and she did not think it was wrong to have asked it. James looked at the ring again. "Keep it," he said, "for now." A pause. He kept it. "I think that means something." She stayed for tea. Mary had insisted, and Eleanor had not resisted, because the house was warm, and the afternoon outside had turned to the mild, uncertain grey of spring clouds, and she had a train at 6, and nowhere to be until it. They talked about other things, about Whitby, which James had never seen and said he thought he might like to see, about the Atelier and Norah's pattern papers, and the dress form still wearing its unfinished wool, about the small grey cat in Mrs. Fowler's courtyard that had not yet warmed to Eleanor. Mary laughed at the last of these, a genuine laugh, brief and unguarded, the laugh of someone who has been moved and is grateful for the relief of something ordinary. When Eleanor left, she stood on the doorstep for a moment. "Mrs. Penhaligon," Mary said. "You said she's in Bristol. She's alive." "As far as I know," Eleanor said. "An old acquaintance had a letter from her a few years ago." Mary nodded slowly. "I would like, if you write to her, I would like her to know that the coat was found, that it found the right place." A pause. "She did a kind thing, keeping it. I want her to know that it mattered." "I'll tell her," Eleanor said. She walked back toward the station through the Hull streets in the late afternoon, the bag lighter now, the coat and the ring left behind, only the box itself and Norah's letter, which she had returned to Mary. The clouds had thickened but not broken, the lighter soft, even grey that made the streets look both ordinary and gentle. She thought about Thomas Cairn, who had sailed north and not returned, and Margaret Holt, who had been generous beyond what was required of her, and Norah Penhaligon, who had protected a child she had never met at the cost of everything she had built, and Mary Heron, who had spent 11 years raising a son on a provision made by a man who had loved her in the way that was available to him. None of them had been entirely what circumstances required. All of them had done what they could. She thought, "This is mostly how it goes." Eleanor returned to Whitby on the evening train. The journey back felt different from the journey out. Not faster, not shorter, but quieter in some essential way, as if the landscape had decided to be gentle with her. The moors in the late evening had lost their daytime distinction and become simply a vast, soft darkness on both sides of the track, interrupted occasionally by the distant light of a farmhouse, warm and small against the immensity of the sky. She did not read. She sat with her hands in her lap and watched the dark countryside pass, and thought about nothing in particular, which was a thing she rarely allowed herself. The train arrived into Whitby at 9:30. The town was quiet. The harbour was still. The swing bridge was closed for the night, the river running black and smooth beneath it, reflecting the lamplight in long, wavering lines. She crossed on foot, her footsteps slow on the wooden boards, and stood for a moment midway across, looking out toward the sea. The sea was dark, and the sky above it was dark, but the horizon was just faintly visible, a barely perceptible distinction between two kinds of darkness, water and sky, meeting in a line so fine it was almost imaginary. She thought about the letter she would finish writing to Norah Penhaligon tomorrow. She had begun it 3 nights ago and had not been able to complete it until now, had not had the ending, had not known what there was to say beyond the facts. Now she knew. You left the coat with the intention that it should be found. It was found. The ring has found its way to the person who, I believe, was always meant to have it. And the woman you were trying to protect, she is well. Her son is well. They have built a life with what they were given, and they are grateful, and they wanted me to tell you that you did not fail anyone. Come back to Whitby, if you can, or don't. I understand there may be reasons. But know that the Atelier is in good hands, and that your pattern papers are on the high shelf, and that the dress form in the corner is still there, and I have not moved it, because it seemed important to leave it. The work you did here mattered. I wanted you to know. She walked the rest of the way home. Mrs. Fowler had left a lamp burning in the window of the chandler's shop below the lodgings, a small, deliberate act of welcome that Eleanor had not expected, and that moved her, briefly and entirely, before she climbed the stairs to her rooms. She sat by the window for a while in the dark, not lighting her own lamp, letting the light from the street come in at its own angle. The grey cat was in the courtyard below. She could see its small shape on the flagstones, sitting very still, looking up at something she couldn't see. She had been in Whitby for 3 weeks and 4 days. She had a room of her own. She had work that was hers. She had a door she could close at the end of the day that opened onto her own space and no one else's. She had not expected, on top of these things, to be given this, a story that was not hers, but that she had been trusted by circumstance and by the patience of a woman she had never met, to carry to its conclusion. She thought, sometimes you find the right room. She thought, sometimes the room has been waiting for you. Outside, the sea moved in its long, slow rhythm, the rhythm it had kept for longer than any of the people in this story, longer than the town itself, longer than the abbey ruins on the cliff, or the steps worn smooth by 300 years of feet. It moved without urgency. It moved without agenda. In and out, in and out. The lamp in the window below burned steadily. The cat in the courtyard sat very still. Somewhere in Bristol, a woman named Norah Penhaligon would, in a few days, receive a letter that would tell her the thing she had been carrying for 11 years had found its ending. Somewhere on Finkel Street in Hull, a young man named James Heron had a ring on his mantelpiece, or perhaps in a drawer, or perhaps already in his pocket, close to hand, that had been made for someone else, and had found its way to him by a route so long and complicated that it felt, in retrospect, almost like intention, almost like the work of someone who had planned it, almost like the work of hands that knew what they were doing. Let your shoulders drop now. Let your hands rest where they are. Loose, open, heavy with the weight of the day, set down. The train has arrived. The bridge has closed. The lamp is lit. You have done enough today. You have carried enough today. Whatever is unfinished can be unfinished until morning, and morning will come in its own time, and you will be rested when it does. Let the sound of the sea come in, if you can hear it, or if you cannot hear it, imagine it. That long, slow, unhurried rhythm, in and out, the sound the world makes when it is not trying to do anything at all. Eleanor sat in the dark for a while longer. Then she went to bed. The harbour was still. The river ran on. The abbey ruins stood on the east cliff in the dark, patient and old and entirely at peace with the passing of time. In the Atelier on the far edge of town, the lamp was out. The workbench was bare. The pattern papers were on the high shelf in their flat box, and the dress form stood in its corner, and the east-facing window held the dark sky and a few stars and the distant, barely visible line where the water met the night. The room was quiet. The room was ready. Sleep now. Rest well. Good night.